40 MI6 agents betrayed, 4,720 pages of classified documents leaked, and yet the Berlin Tunnel became one of the greatest intelligence successes of the Cold War. How does a completely compromised operation still deliver strategic victory? The paradox of Operation Gold illuminates the hidden mathematics of Cold War espionage, where betrayal and success could coexist in the same space. Separated only by the depth of deception each side was willing to sustain. In December 1953, the prevailing constraint was stark. With the Soviets having detonated a hydrogen bomb just 4 months earlier, monitoring Moscow's military intentions had become the CIA's top priority. Almost all Soviet military telephone and telegraph traffic between Moscow, Warsaw, and Bucharest was routed through Berlin over landlines. Without reconnaissance satellites, wiretaps represented one of the few ways Western intelligence could penetrate Soviet military capabilities in real time. The breakthrough mechanism drew directly from Operation Silver, the British tunnel operation in Vienna that had been quietly intercepting Soviet communications since 1949. That operation involved digging a 70-foot tunnel beneath the Imperial Hotel to tap Austrian telephone lines carrying Soviet military traffic. MI6 had even established a Harris Tweed import business as cover, which thrived while secretly funding the intelligence operation beneath. But Berlin presented a far more ambitious challenge. The target cables lay 1,476 feet away, 22 feet longer than the Empire State Building was tall. In contrast to surface intercepts, which Soviet countermeasures could easily detect, underground cable tapping exploited a fundamental vulnerability. Soviet encryption focused on protecting radio transmissions, but landline communications often traveled in plain text, relying on physical security rather than cryptographic protection. CIA scientists had confirmed this approach with a 1953 test. A double agent successfully placed a tap on East Berlin telephone lines that was never discovered. George Blake attended the initial Berlin Tunnel meeting in London between the CIA and MI6, taking the detailed minutes. When Blake next met his KGB contact, he handed him a copy of the minutes from the meeting and a very small sketch, which he drew himself, of how the cable would run, how the tunnel would run, and which cables it would carry. The KGB faced an immediate and complex calculation. Traditional intelligence histories claimed Operation Gold produced no information of value because George Blake warned the KGB about the project before it even began. But recent analysis demonstrates convincingly that valuable information was in fact obtained from the tunnel, largely because the KGB wanted to protect Blake from exposure. The range of intelligence value remains contested between CIA assessments emphasizing success and NSA histories, suggesting more limited returns. Originally costed at $50,000, the final cost of the completed tunnel was over $6.5 million, equivalent to the final procurement cost of 2 Lockheed U-2 spy planes. That investment reflected both the engineering challenge and the strategic stakes. The tunnel ran 1,476 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, requiring excavation of approximately 3,000 tons of soil that had to be disposed of in secret. The KGB's countermove created a new operational constraint that would define the tunnel's entire lifespan. Rather than expose their most valuable Western asset, Soviet intelligence decided to let Operation Gold proceed. They found it preferable to sacrifice some information rather than compromise Blake. The KGB did not inform anyone in Germany, including the East Germans or the Soviet users of the cables, about the taps. According to a CIA report, there were no known attempts to feed disinformation to the CIA. The Soviet military continued to use the cables for communications of intelligence value. This decision transformed the Berlin Tunnel from a straightforward intelligence operation into something more complex, a controlled intelligence leak that served both sides' interests. The Soviets obtained strategic deception by allowing the West to believe their intercepts were secret, while simultaneously protecting their most valuable penetration agent. The CIA gained genuine intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and intentions, unaware that Moscow was managing the flow. For nearly a year, the tunnel collected approximately 90,000 communications, recording 500,000 calls on 50,000 tapes. The intelligence processing continued until September 1958, more than 2 years after the tunnel's discovery. When Blake received a transfer in 1955, the Soviets were free to discover the tunnel. On April 21, 1956, after 11 months and 11 days of operation, Soviet and East German soldiers broke into the eastern end of the tunnel. The Soviets now faced an impossible choice: protect their most valuable Western asset or their most sensitive communications. The decision would require 1,476 feet of German soil to determine which mattered more. 3,100 tons of soil removed, 125 tons of steel plate installed, and cables buried just 19 inches beneath a busy East German highway. How do you hide a construction project equivalent to building a subway station beneath the world's most heavily patrolled border? The Berlin Tunnel operation revealed that Cold War success depended not just on intelligence gathering, but on the audacious engineering required to make that gathering possible in the first place. In September 1954, the first big obstacle was stark: what to do with all the dirt. After many weeks of debate, it was decided they'd create a special basement in the warehouse for the purpose of storing all the dirt. The soil would harden when winter arrived, making digging next to impossible. Plus, the ever-shifting dynamics of the Cold War meant that delays could render the entire operation irrelevant. The breakthrough mechanism began with the construction of a warehouse, which acted as a disguise and had a U.S. Army Elent radar station above it. The warehouse had an unconventionally deep basement at 7 meters, 23 feet, to serve as the staging area for the tunnel and to house the spoil removed. This approach exploited a fundamental vulnerability in Cold War thinking. The Soviets expected monitoring stations at the border, making an obvious radar installation the perfect camouflage. In contrast, direct surface approaches to the cables would have been immediately detected by Soviet patrols that walked regular beats along the border roads. Studies of the soil structure in the Berlin area showed a high percentage of sand. For this reason, it was decided that the tunnel should be lined with steel. The tunnel liner was formed from sections of heavy steel plate constructed so that, when bolted together, 5 sections formed a steel ring approximately 6 feet in diameter and 15 inches long. British engineers constructed a mock-up of the tunnel's terminal end and fabricated an ingenious device called the mole, which worked in principle like a tunnel shield, with hydraulic jacks braced against steel pilings. On September 2, 1954, Captain Williamson's engineers began digging the initial vertical shaft for the tunnel in the basement of the disguised warehouse, working around the clock to complete the 23-foot descent before winter soil conditions would make excavation impossible. The men worked under the cover of the shield, and when a sufficient amount of material had been excavated, the shield was forced forward with hydraulic jacks, and a new section of liner was put in place. The KGB faced immediate constraints balancing their foreknowledge with protecting Blake's cover. Blake apparently alerted the KGB immediately, as 2 of Jalen's agents were caught trying to get a potential tapping wire across a Berlin canal. KGB counterintelligence had to balance their knowledge with protecting Blake's cover, which meant allowing construction to proceed while managing intelligence flow to avoid suspicion. Construction timeline remains disputed among historians. Some sources indicate construction began in September 1954 and was completed in 8 months, while others suggest work began in August 1954 and was completed some 6 months later on February 28, 1955. The discrepancy likely reflects different measurement points: initial excavation versus tunnel completion. The numbers told the scale of the challenge. The finished tunnel was 1,476 feet long, roughly the length of the reflecting pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It ran 1.8 meters, 6 feet, in diameter. The tunnel went 500 yards underground, right to the Soviet border, and another 500 yards to the area containing the main Soviet switching cable facility. The work involved displacing 3,000 tons of dirt, enough to fill more than 20 average American living rooms, and installing the actual physical taps on 3 cables. The key was to draw off as small and as unnoticeable a signal as possible. 3 prefabricated rooms were built to house the men monitoring the underground post, and air conditioning systems were installed. Each chamber had a metal door that sealed it off from the rest of the tunnel. The section immediately adjacent to the tap chamber was insulated and sealed with marine-type plywood to form a closed room. A heavy anti-personnel door of steel and concrete was constructed to seal off the tunnel some 15 yards from the end. The engineers decided at one point that an object of known size in the East Zone would be useful as a reference point, so a baseball game was organized with the objective of knocking a baseball as far into the East Zone as possible. This scheme was frustrated by the friendliness of the East German guards who kept returning the baseball. Nonetheless, the engineers expressed confidence that they knew their position when the tunnel was completed to a point which could be contained in a 6-inch cube. They were correct. Soviet border patrols increased activity but remained unaware of the construction. The constraint shifted from soil management to cable interception precision. Missing the target by inches would render the entire quarter-mile effort worthless. With 1,476 feet of tunnel complete and chambers ready, the operation moved from construction to the delicate art of intercepting enemy communications without detection. Success would depend on touching Soviet cables with microscopic precision. 3 Soviet cables tapped in 62 days, 50,000 reels of magnetic tape recorded, and a 22-year-old Army linguist working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. When your enemy knows your secret, how do you make their knowledge work against them? The Berlin Tunnel revealed that the most sophisticated intelligence operations succeeded not through secrecy alone, but through the careful manipulation of what the enemy believed they knew. In May 1955, the prevailing constraint was microscopic precision. The key was to draw off as small and as unnoticeable a signal as possible, a task requiring skill and a sure hand. Any signal degradation would alert Soviet technicians to the tap. The West was unable to break Soviet encryption at this time. Instead, they took advantage of valuable intelligence gained from unguarded telephone conversations over official channels. The breakthrough mechanism centered on the delicate art of cable interception without detection. British engineers installed reel-to-reel tape recorders, signal amplifiers, and other sophisticated listening devices. The equipment was highly sensitive. It could intercept and analyze even the faintest communications from Soviet lines. The equipment was all in place so that monitoring could begin as soon as the cables were tapped. In contrast to crude wiretaps that often caused line interference, the specialized BPO cable jointing staff achieved signal interception without degrading line quality. The tapping into the 3 cables was carried out by specialist BPO technicians. Scotsman Blake Reimer, the best jointer they had, plus Les Sparks and Arthur Looms. The 3 target cables were tapped on May 11th, May 21st, and August 2nd, 1955. Tapping into the Soviet lines was a complex undertaking that lasted into August. By May 11th, British postal technicians working with enormous delicacy inches below the pavement successfully placed the taps on the first cable. The finished installation used 600 tape recorders that captured all Soviet communication signals on the lines onto thousands of reels of magnetic tape. 22-year-old Corporal Eugene Craig, recruited by the CIA from the Army Language School, was the only Army linguist working on the intercepts, spending virtually all my time listening to freshly recorded tapes, which contained material that couldn't wait to be analyzed elsewhere, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. Tapes were ferried by air to processing centers on a weekly basis. The building's antennae were for electronic intelligence operations conducted by the Signal Corps 9539th Technical Service Unit. The Army Security Agency assumed responsibility, and the 9539th was integrated as the 22D ASA Detachment, 7222D Defense Unit. The 22D ASA Detachment had a 5-person processing unit monitoring and scanning the more productive circuits for hot intelligence. The CIA also recruited 6 Army personnel assigned to the Washington Tape Processing Unit. Russian linguists William O'Connell, William Simpson, and Robert Brown, and German linguists Robert Quinn, Donald Andrews, and Walter Huth. According to the author of a 2019 book about the operation, the Soviets valued Blake so much that they feared his exposure more than a breach of their secrets. The Russians heard about the tunnel before it began, yet did nothing to stop it. So few people were in the know that if Moscow tipped its hand, Blake would have immediately fallen under suspicion. In essence, writes Vogel, the KGB Foreign Intelligence Directorate was sacrificing Soviet military, political, and scientific secrets to protect its own secret, George Blake. Cable tap detectability remains a subject of historical debate. Intelligence histories often suggest telephone taps were easily detected, but the key was to draw off as small and as unnoticeable a signal as possible. Specialized BPO technicians achieved signal interception without degrading line quality, explaining why Soviet technical staff never suspected the taps during 11 months of operation. The range of success estimates varies between CIA assessments emphasizing comprehensive intelligence value and more conservative NSA histories suggesting limited actionable intelligence, likely reflecting different criteria for measuring operational success. The KGB didn't use the tapped lines to spread disinformation. They kept the flow of information as normal as possible to protect their asset Blake. This created a new constraint. Soviet military users remained unaware of the compromise, meaning genuine operational intelligence continued flowing. According to Stephen Budiansky, the KGB's own high-level communications went on a separate system of overhead lines that could not be tapped without being obvious. Concerned above all with protecting Blake as a valuable source inside SIS and unwilling to share its secrets with rival agencies, the KGB had simply left both the GRU and the Stasi in the dark about the tunnel's existence. From their covert base in West Berlin, CIA and MI6 agents listened to Soviet communications for nearly a year. The intelligence contained invaluable information on Soviet troop movements, logistical plans, and military strategies given the highest classification levels. Operation Gold yielded nearly 50,000 six-hour reels of recorded plain text and enciphered traffic, of which nearly 30,000 were fully transcribed. As 50,000 reels of magnetic tape began capturing Soviet secrets, the KGB faced an escalating dilemma. Each day of authentic intelligence intercepted increased the cost of protecting George Blake, but exposing him would reveal the extent of their Western penetration. More than 500,000 calls intercepted, 50,000 reels of magnetic tape produced, and 67,000 hours of Russian and German conversations transcribed by 317 linguists working around the clock. How do you measure success when your enemy knows everything about your operation? The Berlin Tunnel's intelligence harvest revealed that the most compromised operations could still deliver genuine strategic value, provided the adversary faced constraints that prevented them from acting on their knowledge. In May 1955, the prevailing constraint was overwhelming volume. Teleprinter signals, many of them multiplexed, were also collected on magnetic tape and forwarded to Frank Rowlett's Staff D for processing. The volume of raw intelligence vastly exceeded processing capacity. Hundreds of thousands of conversations required native speaker analysis. Even with sophisticated equipment recording continuously, human linguists remain the bottleneck in converting intercepted signals into actionable intelligence. The breakthrough mechanism centered on continuous automated collection feeding into distributed processing networks. Engineers installed 600 tape recorders that captured all Soviet communication signals on the lines onto thousands of reels of magnetic tape. 3 cables were tapped, containing 273 metallic pairs capable of transmitting approximately 1,200 communications channels, the maximum number of channels in use. At any one time approximated 500. On average, 28 telegraphic circuits and 121 voice circuits were recorded continuously. In contrast to selective monitoring, which Soviet operators could detect through irregular line behavior, continuous recording maintained normal electrical characteristics while capturing everything transmitted. According to a CIA report, there were no known attempts to feed disinformation to the CIA. The CIA report states that the Soviet military continued to use the cables for communications of intelligence value. The KGB didn't use the tapped lines to spread disinformation. They kept the flow of information as normal as possible to protect their asset, Blake. The KGB did not inform anyone in Germany, including the East Germans or the Soviet users of the cables, about the taps. Soviet military commanders continued using compromised lines because they remained unaware of the interception, creating the paradox of genuine intelligence from a compromised operation. In London, 317 Russian émigrés and German linguists worked through 67,000 hours of recorded conversations, while teleprinter signals collected on magnetic tape were forwarded to Frank Rowlett's Staff Deprocessing Unit in Washington for analysis of multiplexed Soviet communications. The Americans were able to listen to telephone conversations for nearly a year, eventually recording roughly 90,000 communications. The tunnel operated for 11 months and 11 days. Intelligence value assessment remains disputed among historians. Early assessments claimed no worthwhile intelligence ever resulted from the intercepts, wasting the equivalent of $51 million in today's dollars, with the Soviets using the phone lines for a disinformation campaign. But CIA's own analysis concluded there were no known attempts to feed disinformation, and the intelligence collected was genuine, yielding valuable intelligence for U.S. policymakers and war fighters. The range of estimates varies between 90,000 communications recorded according to some CIA sources versus more than 500,000 calls in other accounts, likely reflecting different measurement criteria for what constituted a discrete communication event. The intelligence products included order of battle and information on Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces, including the Soviets' lack of action regarding a military invasion of Western Europe. The operation yielded identification of workers on Soviet atomic energy projects and early warning of the Soviets' establishment of an East German army. By the time Operation Gold ended, the CIA had eavesdropped on some 50,000 reels of tape, monitored 443,000 fully transcribed conversations between the Soviets and East Germans, accumulated 40,000 hours of telephone conversations, and gathered 1,750 intelligence reports. Inside, the British and the Americans listened and recorded the messages flowing to and from Soviet military headquarters in Zossen, near Berlin, conversations between Moscow and the Soviet embassy in East Berlin, and conversations between East German and Soviet officials. The processing timeline extended far beyond the tunnel's operational life. The tunnel mission continued with 2 additional years of data processing through September 1958. When Blake received a transfer in 1955, the Soviets were free to discover the tunnel. The KGB could now expose the operation without compromising their assets' cover, but they needed to stage the discovery as accidental. The constraint shifted from protecting Blake to managing the propaganda implications of revealing Western intelligence capabilities. After collecting 500,000 conversations and processing 67,000 hours of Russian and German intelligence, the operation faced its predetermined end. The Soviets would soon stage an accidental discovery on April 22, 1956, a date that would transform espionage failure into propaganda victory. 11 months and 11 days of operation, April 22, 1956, and 50,000 East Berliners paraded through a tunnel their government wanted them to see. How do you stage an accident so perfectly that your enemies believe it for decades? The Berlin Tunnel's staged discovery demonstrated that the most sophisticated deceptions succeeded not through concealment, but through the careful choreography of revelation itself. In April 1956, when Blake received a transfer from his position, the Soviets were free to discover the tunnel. The KGB needed to expose the operation without revealing their foreknowledge or compromising their intelligence advantage from having Blake within Mi-6. The constraint was timing. They needed to protect their most valuable asset while staging a propaganda victory that would embarrass the West. The breakthrough mechanism centered on exploiting natural cover for an artificial discovery. Heavy spring rains that damaged one of the cables in 1956 gave Soviet intelligence an excuse to inspect the communications lines and make it appear as if they had stumbled across the tunnel. In contrast to an obvious raid that would raise questions about their intelligence sources, the maintenance cover story provided plausible deniability. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev planned to use the tunnel to score propaganda points, but he did not wish to embarrass the British government on the eve of his visit to London. He planned to emphasize the American role in the tunnel while downplaying British involvement. On April 22, 1956, Soviet and East German soldiers broke into the tunnel's eastern end, announcing the discovery to international press. A Soviet officer conducted a press conference showing reporters CIA electronic monitoring equipment, with newspapers worldwide running photographs of the underground partition bearing a sign in German and Russian reading, "Entry is forbidden by the commanding general." American personnel, using night vision equipment, detected 40 to 50 Soviet soldiers digging at 3 to 5 foot intervals. In the planning phase, the CIA and CIS had estimated that the Soviets would cover up any discovery of the tunnel through embarrassment and potential repercussions. Instead, the Soviets announced the discovery to the press and called it a breach of the norms of international law and a gangster act. After exposing the tunnel on April 22, 1956, the Soviets and East Germans immediately tried to squeeze out a propaganda victory. They held a news conference, something the Soviet military almost never did, and invited reporters from both sides of the border to attend. Discovery circumstances remain disputed among intelligence historians. A CIA report at the time details that the tunnel was discovered because of heavy rainfall that entered a faulty cable, causing sections to be dug up for repair, versus later evidence that the KGB allowed the operation to continue until April 1956, when they discovered the tunnel while supposedly repairing faulty underground cables to protect Blake. Later declassifications confirmed the discovery was staged by the KGB, but CIA analysts remained convinced of the accidental discovery until Blake's exposure in 1961. The Soviet maintenance crew accidentally found the tunnel allowing it to operate unimpeded from May 1955 to April 1956. When the Germans discovered the tap on April 22, 1956, the Berlin tunnel's operations ceased. The tap wires were cut at 15:35 hours on Sunday afternoon, ending 11 months and 11 days of continuous intelligence collection. One source indicates that the wiretap had been in service for roughly 18 months, though this likely includes planning and construction time along with operational collection. Soviet propaganda victory backfired spectacularly. Instead of condemning the operation, most world media portrayed the tunnel project as a brilliant piece of engineering. The press portrayed it as a venture of extraordinary audacity rather than an intelligence failure. When word of the Berlin tunnel operation was finally revealed, reaction in the United States was gleeful. The press had a field day with banner headlines across the nation. At the CIA, however, the spooks were elated that the communists had gone public. Planners had assumed they would find the tunnel eventually but hush it up. In the ensuing weeks, as Washington remained silent about its complicity, the communist authorities paraded 50,000 East Berliners through the tunnel to give them a first-hand glimpse of the enemy's filthy trick. As one East German official put it, CIA officials reveled in the news coverage. America's spymasters were thrilled by the world's response, admiration for the CIA's daring and technical prowess, and a general assumption that the agency had roundly snookered the Soviets. As Soviet soldiers displayed CIA equipment to international reporters, the ultimate question remained unanswered. Had the tunnel's 11 months and 11 days of betrayed operation actually produced valuable intelligence, or was it history's most expensive eavesdropping on disinformation? 42 years in prison, September 1958 processing completion, and a 98-year-old spy who died defending his betrayal in Moscow. How did the Cold War's greatest betrayal become one of its greatest intelligence successes? The Berlin Tunnel's final paradox proved that in espionage, even the enemy's complete foreknowledge couldn't guarantee failure when protecting sources mattered more than preventing intelligence collection. In 1956, CIA analysts faced an unprecedented constraint in evaluating Operation Gold. CIA analysts have argued about the overall worth of the intelligence that they had gathered. By one assessment, the Soviets had allowed ordinary military communications to flow through the cables to project the illusion that the Soviets had no aggressive intent against West Berlin. How do you measure the value of intelligence when you suspect your enemy knows you're listening? The breakthrough came through methodical post-operation analysis that revealed the KGB's strategic miscalculation. According to the author of a 2019 book about the operation, the Soviets valued Blake so much that they feared his exposure more than a breach of their secrets. The KGB didn't use the tapped lines to spread disinformation. They kept the flow of information as normal as possible to protect their asset, Blake. Also, they were unwilling to share their secrets with rival agencies internally and with their allies, so they didn't inform the Soviets' main intelligence directorate, the GRU, or Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, who both carried on freely discussing information on the tapped lines. In contrast to feeding false intelligence through the compromised lines, which would have maximized deception, the KGB chose source protection over operational security. Blake himself measured success by his betrayals. He always referenced his compromise of the Berlin Tunnel as his greatest singular accomplishment. Blake was later arrested and sentenced to a 42-year prison term, an unprecedented sentence for espionage in Britain, but made a daring escape from the heavily fortified Wormhood Scrubs prison in England in 1966 and found his way to Moscow, where he was treated as a hero. To evaluate this deluge, the work of mining Operation Gold continued until September 1958, 2 additional years of processing after tunnel shutdown. The taps collected successfully for nearly a year, and processing the immense volume of data took more than 2 years after the tunnel was shut down. The after-action damage assessment compiled by the CIA's PBJ and TLY staff in August 1956 ran some 100 pages. Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles called it one of the most valuable and daring projects ever undertaken by the agency. In October 1966, Blake escaped in a manner worthy of a Hollywood screenplay. He broke a window in the cell block, climbed out, ran to the wall and climbed over using a rope ladder made of rope and knitting needles, eventually reaching Moscow, where he lived as a KGB hero until his death in 2020. Blake was awarded the Order of Friendship on his 85th birthday by Vladimir Putin. He remained a committed Marxist-Leninist until his death on December 26, 2020, aged 98, in Moscow. The disseminated material was designated to have originated from Source Regal, and at the time was believed to be providing unique reporting on military reorganization, East German army establishment, and thousands of Soviet personnel identifications. Despite the leak, the CIA gained substantial intelligence. The operation also cemented methods for future covert operations and set a precedent for CIA-KGB chess games during the Cold War. More than anything, it showcased the audacity, technological prowess, and the lengths to which both sides would go to outsmart each other. Operation effectiveness despite betrayal remains disputed among intelligence historians. History tells us that the tunnel operation was a source of thousands of pieces of Russian disinformation mixed with authentic feed materials so as to provide the illusion of success, versus CIA's assessment that the Soviets had not attempted to feed false information over the lines. The intelligence that had been collected was genuine. Blah. Key asserted that 99% of the information gleaned from the taps were authentic, supporting the CIA's conclusion. The range of assessments varies between critics claiming complete deception and CIA analysis showing genuine strategic intelligence, with the discrepancy reflecting different criteria for measuring operational success versus compromise. The success of the betrayed operation established a new intelligence doctrine. Even compromised operations could yield strategic value when adversaries must protect their sources. This principle influenced Cold War intelligence strategy for decades, demonstrating that source protection sometimes outweighed operational security. The KGB's decision to sacrifice Soviet military secrets rather than expose Blake proved that the most valuable intelligence assets were human sources, not individual operations. The Berlin Tunnel's 1,476 feet had proven that in the world of espionage, even the enemy's foreknowledge couldn't guarantee failure, Sometimes the greatest secrets lay not in what was hidden, but in what the other side was willing to sacrifice to keep their own secrets safe. The Berlin Tunnel proves that in espionage, sometimes your greatest failures become your most valuable successes. For 11 months and 11 days, the CIA eavesdropped on Soviet military secrets while the KGB listened to every conversation. Yet both sides claimed victory. But this is just one piece of the Cold War's hidden chess game. What story should we uncover next? Drop a comment below. Are you curious about Project Azorian's submarine heist, the hunt for Soviet nuclear subs, or the race to crack unbreakable codes? Your suggestions shape our next deep dive. If you're fascinated by the technology, betrayals, and brilliant minds that define the Cold War, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We publish new intelligence histories every few days, diving deep into declassified archives most channels never touch. Like this video if the Berlin Tunnel's paradox surprised you, and share it with anyone who thinks they know how the Cold War really worked. Until next tale, remember, in the world of espionage, the most dangerous secrets aren't always the ones being stolen, sometimes they're the ones being protected. This is Cold War Tales. Keep digging deeper.